Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Alex Fuerte. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the marketing and communications manager here at San Diego Pride. I'm also a member of the San Diego Queer APIMEDA Coalition, which creates safe spaces and capacity building for queer APIMEDA folks. And I'm also the co-chair of the San Diego API Coalition, which was formed in the last year as a response to the rise in xenophobia and anti-API violence. The San Diego API Coalition acts as a hub for API serving organizations in the region to collaborate and resource share. And in that spirit of collaboration, we've got a great lineup of amazing community leaders throughout the country here for you today. I'm from San Diego, by the way, if that wasn't obvious. So before we get started, I just wanted to bring up a few quick notes. First off, thank you to our ASL interpreters. When speaking, please do not speak over each other and be mindful of your pace. We're not in webinar mode, so if you'd like to see who is spotlighted, including the ASL interpreters, please select speaker view, and that's usually on the top right-hand corner of your screen. Now we're here to create a welcoming and supportive environment, encouraging healthy dialogue and discussion. So please treat your fellow audience members and panelists with respect and care, acknowledging the time and energy it takes to be present. We've got some amazing task force moderators. Thank you, Cindy, Thaisa, who will be helping field any questions you might have. So leave them in the chat. Feel free to leave them in the chat. And then we'll have a Q&A after the panelists go through their questions. So we encourage you to ask them in the chat or unmute yourself if you're comfortable doing so. And don't forget to stay for the second hour, which will be a happy hour led by Brian Silva of the National Equality Action Team. He's going to show us a few simple and fun ways we can personally take action right from your own couch, my favorite place, to support the Equality Act and other issues we care deeply about using everyday tools like your phone and social media. We'll kick off that hour with a few messages from transgender activist and model and my personal fashion icon, Gina Rosero, and US Congressperson Mark Takano. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the other moderator who will introduce and lead the panelists through a series of questions, Executive Director of the National Queer API Alliance, who by the way hit his 3-month anniversary yesterday, Kenrick Ross.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. Joining us everywhere. So I see from across the United States and the Pacific. So I am delighted to join you today. This is my first major event as Executive Director of NQAPIA. So I do want to give a shout out to all of our Federation members across the country and the Pacific who have done incredible work over the last, well, since the beginning of NQAPIA, but certainly during the pandemic, to hold and make communities stronger. Before we get into our panel, I want to give a special thank you to Alex, who came up with this concept of this panel, brought it to me, and has been fantastic in moving it forward. He has driven this event and has made it possible for NQAPIA, for our partners. So Alex, thank you so much for your work and your commitment to this. The task force has been phenomenal. The National LGBTQ Task Force has been phenomenal in pulling this together, making this happen logistically, programmatically, bringing it to you on multiple platforms. So it's incredible that San Diego Pride and APIMEDA are new partners of NQAPIA, and the task force is our oldest partner. So we are in a fantastic company, and very pleased to be here. Also, before we start, I want to acknowledge today is the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd by policing and our current system of law enforcement. It has been a difficult year for this country and the world because not just of what happened, but the movement that it inspired. Some of us have been inspired, frustrated, exhausted, motivated, sometimes on the same day. So I want to uplift George Floyd's family and his circle of people who have mourned his loss, those who have been on the front lines of seeking justice, not for him, but every victim of state-sanctioned violence, and everyone who turned out in their own way, in their own space, to advance the cause of justice. I hope what we are doing in the next 2 hours is part of a commitment to bending the arc of the moral universe towards justice in each and every way that we can. So I'm so grateful for you to join us and to get this conversation started. So we will start with Georgia State Representative Sam Park, who represents House District 101. Sam also has a historical distinction of being the first openly gay man to be elected to the Georgia legislature and the first Asian American Democrat to be elected to Georgia State Assembly. Welcome, Sam. We are delighted to have you join us. So I want to kick off our panel. The API community in Georgia has been in the spotlight of our national conversation for celebratory reasons and for devastating reasons over the last 6 months. Years of activism by API advocates, but also allies who believe the API community in Georgia is part of the future of the South, really lifted the level of civic participation during the November elections. The API community was very much at the center of a lot of the campaigning for the January runoffs, when much of the country was focused on Georgia, and also on API voter turnout, which was record-breaking. And then of course, on March 16th, and the evening of March 16th, the horrific murders across Atlanta of mostly API women allowed a trend that we had been seeing, the latest spike in anti-Asian violence in our history, to kind of enter the national conversation. Certainly we in API spaces, we in social justice spaces had been seeing it for a very long time, but now it has become part of a national conversation long overdue. You are part of the vanguard of leadership for LGBTQ API folks, not just nationally, but certainly in Georgia. How has it been a community leader navigating the last 6 months, these different parts of the spectrum of being part of that community and of being one of its leaders?
Well, Kenrick, first off, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with everyone in Georgia. So it's the evening, so good evening, everyone. Pronouns are he, him, his. I want to first off, say happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, especially on this 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death, which is a reminder of all the work that we must continue to do to ensure justice for all of our communities. And in doing so, I want to lift up a specific individual and then a community of leaders that gave opportunities for myself. But first, Stacey Abrams. The result that we saw in November and the January runoffs, in which we saw unprecedented turnout amongst Asian Americans, but amongst so many different communities of color, did not happen overnight. This was the intentional effort and investment of leaders like Stacey Abrams, but really Stacey Abrams being the vanguard of the vanguard of investing in people, regardless of our race, our ethnicity, our national origin, but working to, first off, recognizing our dignity, but also working to empower people. And so it's her work, along with so many others, such as Ense Ufot at New Georgia Project, Stephanie Cho at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, who for years have been embedded in the communities, working to engage their civic participation, educating them and empowering them to use the power that they have to bring about the change that we saw and that helped change the course of this country. So first, I have to give a shout out to Leader Abrams, Stacey, who was also my leader and gave me an opportunity, gave me my start in politics, quite frankly, when I interned for her back in 2012. But second, the opportunities I have in the Georgia State Legislature of being the first openly gay man elected, that was only made possible because of the women who paved the way, who broke barriers and paved the way for someone like me. 17 years ago, Carla Drenner was the first LGBT individual ever elected to the Georgia General Assembly. Then it was Black women, Simone Bell, Park Cannon, Keisha Waits, who again broke barriers to give someone like myself an opportunity. And so I think I say that all to say it's so important as we can, one, celebrate the progress we've made, but also acknowledge the challenges we face and the work that we still have to do, to thank those who've made the way for us, but also to understand now it's our turn, that we have to continue to pave the way for the next generation of leaders and continue to carry the torch alongside these amazing transformative leaders who gave us the opportunity to serve and be where we are today. So long prologue to your specific question, but certainly I think over the past 6 to 12 months, it's been incredibly challenging here in Georgia with the confluence of multiple unprecedented challenges from the pandemic to the awakening and demand of social justice to the presidency of Trump, who inflamed and amplified the underlying xenophobia that's always existed, that anti-immigrant sentiment that's always existed in this country, and that and because of his rhetoric, made it that much easier to blatantly, physically, and broad daylight attack members of the Asian American community, particularly the most vulnerable, women and the elderly. As Congresswoman Grace Meng said, that rhetoric put a target on the backs of our kids and our parents. And so amidst this challenging period of time, I think without a doubt in my mind, that helped drive the unprecedented turnout in Asian American voters that wanted change, that wanted a leader that represented the America that they came here for, one that would not scapegoat them to deflect blame and responsibility, but one that embraced and wanted to ensure that the contributions of Asian Americans to this country would help ensure that we can continue to move forward and ultimately live up to the promise of ensuring liberty, equality, and justice for all of our communities, for all of our people. So, it was really a thrill and a joy to see so many Asian Americans turn out, not just during the November elections, but to come back out again right after such a grueling election season to ensure that we had a Democratic Senate and an opportunity, perhaps a once in a lifetime or once in a generation type opportunity to pass the Equality Act and continue to make transformative change for the LGBTQ plus community here in America. But of course, while all of this was going, while we were seeing the next generation drive demographic change, which brought about political change in the state of Georgia, we continued to grapple with and experience this elevated rise of discrimination and violence toward Asian Americans. And that culminated with the March 16th shooting, which so many of my friends and neighbors in Georgia of Asian American descent felt that that was a personal attack. And certainly they felt that they could be. This happened literally a week or two around the same time in which Georgia passed Senate Bill 202 that would have made it harder for our citizens to vote. As Asian Americans, especially amidst the pain and grief that they were suffering, as they were trying to speak out and ensure that their voices were heard. Here we had politicians trying to silence their voices, make it more difficult for them to exercise a power that they wield as American citizens. But in spite of it all, I saw an enormous amount of resilience from the Asian American community. There was an unprecedented amount of organizing that occurred immediately in response to the March 16th shooting that is continuing the momentum that we saw from the November election, in which no doubt in my mind, I think the Asian American community here in Georgia and hopefully around this country will continue to be a force for positive change and solidarity with our communities of color, and really bring about the kind of meaningful change that not only are we demanding, but that we so desperately need. So with that, again, thank you for having me, and I'll turn it back over to Kendra.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you for the work that you're doing in Georgia on behalf of our communities. We will come back to you in our second round, but we're gonna go to Tiffany Tran. Tiffany is a Senior Legislative Manager for the National LGBTQ Task Force. Tiffany, the task force has done an amazing job of advancing the Equality Act. We're gonna see a phenomenal presentation event in the next hour. Why is the Equality Act so important, and why is this form of outreach and engagement so important to getting it done?
Yeah, of course. So again, Kenrick, thank you for having me, and everyone who's here today. We're really appreciative of just your attendance and also your engagement, because when it comes to the Equality Act, which the National LGBTQ Task Force has worked so hard to try to get, to try to push forward, we're doing it because we see this window of opportunity and the progress that's been made so far. When I joined this past January, actually, it was before Georgia went ahead and had the outcome they did with the Georgia Senate seats, which is why it's such a great opportunity to have Representative Park with us here today. But once we saw the outcome of the Georgia Senate elections, we knew that we have a huge window of opportunity to really get the Equality Act passed. But that doesn't mean it's a shoo-in, right? The reason why we are working so hard, especially here at the task force, here at the partnered organizations we have here today, as well as the orgs that we're working with on a daily basis, we need 60 votes to get the Equality Act passed. What that means is even with 50 Democrats in the Senate and 50 Republicans, we need all the Democrats plus 10 Republican votes. And so while this is not impossible to get, which is why we're working so hard to make it happen, we definitely need all hands on deck, which is why we are hosting this event here today, as well as the API action night that's following in the hour that follows. But for folks who don't know, the Equality Act, if passed, it will amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So what that means is this bill will prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in employment, housing, public accommodations, education, federally funded programs, and jury service. So this covers a lot. And what folks may be surprised to know is that there are actually not these federal non-discrimination protections in all the states that we have across the country. We have some states in our country who are fully protected, and then we have other states that are not, which is honestly kind of unfathomable to think about in this day and age. But currently, 29 states don't have these laws that explicitly protect LGBTQ people from discrimination. And so if we were to get this Equality Act passed, this would be a federal bill that would protect all LGBTQ people in states, no matter where you live, no matter where you reside, no matter where you go to work, no matter where you go to school, protects your family who are part of the community, all of that. And so understanding that it takes, elected officials from across the aisle to get this passed, this is why your engagement here as attendees, as constituents, as voters is so important. So I just want to mention really quickly that, the support for the Equality Act is broad. We have support from Democrats looking at 94%. We have Republicans at 68%, independents at 85%. I also want to mention that about 5 million people in the LGBTQ community who identify as people of faith are supportive of the Equality Act. And so with the bill passing out of the House at the end of February, it is currently, being waited to be taken up for a vote in the US Senate, which is why we all have you here today, like I've said. And I just want to raise my gratitude, the task force's gratitude, to all the partners, to all the orgs who are putting their sweat, they're all hands on deck, in and out to get this passed. And so currently, with the past protections that we have, it is not enough. It is certainly not enough. And with President Biden in the House, who promised this as a campaign plan, we really do see this as a window of opportunity here. So I know we're going to talk a little bit about the Equality Act later, Kenrick, so that's all I'll say for now. But in case there's anything else, we will talk about the status of it a little later down in the program.
Great, thank you, Tiffany. We are very close, as you said, so we just got to get it done. Our next panelist is Ariana Cavallini. Ariana is a social worker in Indianapolis and an organizer with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. She's a part of Indiana chapter where members across the state are building power towards reproductive justice with AAPI women, girls, and gender nonconforming folks. Ariana, why is it so important for us to make sure that queer and trans women and gender nonconforming individuals are included and centered in the fight for women's rights, particularly in our API communities?
Thank you, Kenrick. Thank you all so much for having me on this panel today. I really appreciate it. So in NAPOF, we utilize a reproductive justice framework to support all areas of our work. And this includes advocacy for LGBTQ women and gender nonconforming folks. And in a space where I'm talking about reproductive justice, it's important for me to clarify that this is a concept developed by Black women activists, and particularly in organizations like Sister Song. And it's the right to decide if you want to parent, when you want to parent, and under what conditions you parent. And this framework also supports body autonomy and the right to live in communities that are free from violence. And reproductive justice also centers and uplifts marginalized groups. So when we talk about families from a reproductive justice perspective, we're talking about all types of families. So that includes those with LGBTQ parents and family members. So policies like the Equality Act can allow for these families to preserve their safety and well-being, and they can also ensure that healthy communities can be fostered. We also know that, unfortunately, violence against LGBTQ folks exists in multiple forms. There's a survey from the National LGBTQ Task Force that showed us that 98% of LGBT AAPIs reported facing some form of discrimination in their lives, which is a pretty significant number. So if people in our communities continue to experience conditions that are unsafe, their right to make decisions about their lives, their families, and their communities becomes compromised as well. And we've seen AAPI women being impacted during the pandemic due to gendered violence and racialized misogyny that has led them to feel unsafe. So 78% of AAPI women have reported racism, that racism against Asians has had at least some impact on their lives over the past 2 years. And this has occurred in instances of being called racial slurs, feeling unsafe outside, or experiencing harassment and discrimination in the workplace, just to give a few examples. And these hate incidents that Asian American women have experienced are frequently reported as happening on public streets and in businesses. And this data also shows the urgent need for gender-based protections in public spaces and in service areas, which is a huge part of the Equality Act as well. And to answer your question, the inclusion of queer, trans, and gender nonconforming folks is essential in the fight for gender equity, because these individuals have long been leaders in this movement. And many of these people are also people of color, and their leadership in our shared communities is too often ignored and forgotten. So when we look at NAPOF, there are a number of AAPI queer and trans women and non-binary folks who are leaders in our communities and in their chapters across the country. And this is a reflection of how our movements are being led and who they are being led by. So a few things that we're focusing on in NAPOF is advocating for healthcare access, so particularly around issues that impact the most vulnerable folks in the AAPI community, which also includes LGBTQ folks. And we also call for the disaggregation of data in order to better understand the needs of our community members, because as many of us have experienced, Asian Americans are often seen as a monolith, and this is no exception to that. So when we don't have the data that's disaggregated by ethnicity or gender, we likely also don't have data that encompasses the needs of LGBTQ AAPIs. So when we do have access to critical information like this, we can better advocate and allocate resources to those who need them. But overall, all parts of our identities are reflective of our lived experiences, and those experiences should be validated, they should be honored, and they should be uplifted as we work towards policies like the Equality Act and as we work to transform our futures.
Thank you, Ariana. NAPOF is also a great partner of NQAPIA, so please do check out their work. Ariana, we will circle back to you in the next round of questions. I want to bring on Vivian Chang. Vivian is the Civic Engagement Manager for the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, APALA. And Vivian, during the pandemic, there were so many API folks who were essential workers. We saw this in our communities, we saw it on TV, we applauded, we cheered, and we were among those essential workers as well. What have we learned about how to protect and build power with API workers coming out of the worst of the pandemic?
Great question, Kenrick. And I also appreciate the recognition that this work doesn't stop and some of the work hasn't started yet. So just to build on that, API workers literally kept us alive during COVID. They're our nurses working in grocery stores, part of the food system. And unfortunately, like a lot of the impacts to API workers was obscured. So just to lift some of that up, 1/3 of all nurse deaths due to COVID happen among Filipino nurses, yet they're only 4% of the workforce. And I know a lot of folks are not necessarily even aware that that is such a huge proportion of our workforce. So, this pandemic has made visible a lot of the inequalities that we've all faced in our lives, but even so, there are still so many keeping us down and exploiting and oppressing API workers. So, similarly, Pacific Islanders had some of the highest rates of COVID deaths, and that's on top of the displacement and imperialism that are threatening these Indigenous communities. So what we've learned, first of all, is that this is the reality, that like folks can't keep buying into the model minority myth and say, oh, Asian Americans are good, like API workers don't need help. Right? That has always been a mechanism to silence us. And, even when folks are pushed back, like those voices have been ignored, marginalized for the sake of white supremacy. So we know that like very first step, we have to listen, we have to lift up these issues. So recognizing that API workers face exploitation. And especially, like queer LGBTQ API workers, they're often misgendered in the same way a lot of folks are, pushed aside, and they face harassment due to their gender identity, sexual orientation, on top of anti-Asian violence. So, that looks like the physical violence that Sam was talking about and Ariana was sharing about, that looks like discrimination. Throughout the pandemic, we've heard from healthcare workers who had patients that said, I don't want to be treated by someone who's Asian because, of a lot of the racist COVID myths. So that discrimination prevents people from doing their job, prevents people from being of service to the community as they want to be. And there's, on top of the isolation a lot of us have experienced, API workers have experienced even more extreme, like alienation, whether that's in workplaces, in public transit, in any of these public-facing jobs, again, because of these myths and this discrimination. So, what we have to do is, right, like listen to this, lift it up, but also build power and include API workers in all that we're doing. And I'll say this, coming from the labor movement, APALA, like we know that oftentimes API workers are not included, they're not thought of when we think about who are the most impacted workers. But for example, during COVID, Asian American workers now have one of the highest unemployment levels. But when we hear the narratives about who's impacted or who's losing jobs, it doesn't show up. So, a lot of that has to come from us, but hopefully like we can also be changing the institutions that write these narratives. So, on top of that, it's that everyday grind of organizing, and making sure that if we have to organize everyone, because if we don't, like when we leave behind the most vulnerable folks, that means we also leave behind liberation for us all.
Thank you, Vivian. And I do want to uplift something you said about certain groups of people are not seen in the conversations in, for example, in labor, workforce issues, small businesses, for example. And we wanted to make sure that we were bringing the different perspectives of how everyone in our community, of course, we don't have a large enough panel to make sure, but to the ability we could tonight to bring in as many diverse voices representing different sectors and different aspects of our community. So we also acknowledge that we could not bring in everything, but we hope that we are giving a perspective from different aspects of the community, particularly in the conversation about how the Equality Act will bring us closer to equity on the issues that we're working on every day, and how it will bring the country closer to greater fairness. So I want to go back to Tiffany to the question of, there are some protections in place. We've seen over the years, we've made progress in some places with some bills, with some laws. The Equality Act is uniform, it is expansive. Can you dwell on why this is needed as the next big step towards fairness and equality?
Yeah, definitely. And you know, before I mention about why it's needed across the country, I want to echo Representative Park's statement, you know, to raising celebration about API Heritage Month and the momentum that we saw in the API community, not only in our presidential election, but of course, you know, the Georgia Senate elections, because he talked about, you know, intentional effort and investment, right? And so we are doing that as organizations, as constituents, as voters. We are doing that across the board for legislative issues that matter. And this time around, the Equality Act is definitely one of them. And so I raise that because I say there is intention behind getting involved, being engaged, voting first and foremost about who is in that position, who is in that seat, because that makes all the difference, right? And so to answer your question, Kenrick, about why the Equality Act is so important and why we need it across the board is because I am currently in California, right? I work for the task force in DC. I'll be moving over there when we make that move back. But if I was a high school student here in California and I wanted to go to school in Arizona or Texas, just by crossing state borders, I do not have the same protections that I would have if I went to Arizona or Texas that I did in California, right? I have this luxury as a California resident that as part of the LGBT community, I know I'm protected. We don't have that currently. And there's folks who feel that they can't live the life that they want to live or be who they want to be, depending on their zip code, depending on, like I said, where they work, where they go to school, where their family lives, things of that nature. And so what we call this is patchwork protections, right? And we need federal non-discrimination protections. Federal meaning across the board. We don't need state protections, we need federal protections. We need state protections, but in addition to that, you know, we need federal protection. So you can feel like you can live anywhere you want and be protected based on who you are. And so I'd mentioned a little bit earlier about the 60 votes with the filibuster that we currently have, you know, 50 Democrats in the House, 50 Democrats in the Senate, 50 Republicans. We need those 60 votes to get this Equality Act passed. And so that is why I cannot stress enough that elected officials listen to their constituents. And everyone who is watching here, everyone who is watching now, unless you live in DC, I'm sorry, you have a senator who wants to hear from you. And you have a senator and a legislator who wants to know how you want them to vote, because they care about their seat, you know, they care about what they vote on. And so that is why after this hour here, we are going to lead into AP Action Night, where you will all have opportunities to engage and do outreach to your senators about the Equality Act specifically. And so, Henrik, this window of opportunity that we have, when we think about legislative issues, we think about the bill in one hand and we think about the window of opportunity in another, right? We've been working to get these Equality Act passed for so long now. And this time it's a little different because of who we have elected and where we see this opportunity taking us. And so because of that, I encourage you all to please get involved, please get engaged, and you know, talk to your family and friends about reaching out to their senators about the Equality Act. And so we need these protections. And you know, if you join us for API Action Night, you will get that opportunity.
Thanks, Tiffany. Before we open up the floor to questions, and definitely send us your questions, so we're going to move to the Q&A very shortly. I want to turn back to our panelists for some quick reflections or comments on how the Equality Act, getting this passed and signed, will impact the work that you are doing and your organization is doing. So I'll open the floor to any of our panelists who want to go. Please do.
I'll jump right in.
Sam?
If I may.
Yeah.
So, you know, Georgia has one of the weakest civil rights laws in the nation, period. This is an issue near and dear to my heart. In the past 5 years I've been in the legislature, every single year we've worked on introducing comprehensive civil rights protections to protect not just the LGBTQ community, but people of color as well. Just as an example, you know, Georgia has no law that prevents private employers from discriminating on the basis of race, right? Local businesses can refuse to serve based on their religion. Landowners can refuse to sell or rent based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And so, you know, passage of the Equality Act would truly bring about meaningful change for hundreds of thousands of Georgians and people across the state and conservative states, unfortunately, that has not made the kind of progress that we've seen in states like California. But from a state perspective, another reason why I think it's just so imperative that we do everything we can to get the Equality Act across the finish line is that we've seen yet another barrage of anti-LGBTQ pieces of legislation across the country in multiple states, specifically targeting trans youth and trans kids, which is just unconscionable. And of course, this is all at the same time in which many of the same politicians driving these anti-LGBTQ pieces of legislation are also trying to pass bills to restrict the ability of citizens to vote, to cling on to power. And so again, it's all the more reason why we have to do everything we can from more progressive states to do our part to ensure passage of this incredibly important bill in the US Congress. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. And anyone else want to chime in quickly?
Sure. Just to build on what Sam said, like the clear benefits, and it's, you know, sometimes we talk about benefits, but it's just like a removal of discrimination, right? So yes, it's a benefit, but it's getting us back to square one for a lot of folks. But that flows to like everyone, and especially for workers, it's so critical because the discrimination that LGBTQ workers face, like especially for API workers, also prevents them from being able to support their families, prevents them from organizing, and it really is holding back the labor movement because it holds back the people power that we need to topple corporate bosses. So, and you know, like Sam said, in a lot of states it's just so non-standardized. So folks are facing discrimination based on gender identity, sexual orientation. They're also facing discrimination based on race, accent, immigration status. So as we are trying to like fight all of these barriers, like let's keep removing them, and the Equality Act gets us there, you know, like one step at a time.
I just really want to flag really quick that, you know, people don't, maybe they do realize, but people, it takes some application to understand that once laws get passed, they affect real people. They affect real people in their real lives, in their daily lives, not only from this future on forward, but the lives that they have lived so far, right? And so once we pass a law, you know, it's important to be deeply involved in implementing that across the country. You know, regulations are needed, but nuts and bolts will help in seeing this law implemented. And people just need to remember that like businesses will need to, you know, come to understand how these laws will affect them, because once a federal bill is passed, it affects, especially the Equality Act, it affects people in every aspect of their lives, right? And so these are tangible actions that we see coming into place. And so that is why it's so important that this Equality Act is on the table, and why we are just, I don't know, I'm very passionate about it, speaking to it, why people remember that this is a real thing affecting real people.
Yeah, I really want to second what Tiffany said. I really appreciate all of that. And also being from Indiana, LGBTQ folks here have experienced a number of social and political barriers, and the social and political go hand in hand. And they often feel isolation from their community members and have a lack of protections. And oftentimes here in Indiana, they've not been granted explicit protections against discrimination. And in my own life, I've heard far too many stories from queer and trans people here who have expressed pain and fear and grief because of who they are. And I want to live in a place where I can see my community members thriving and where we can instead hear stories of liberation and of joy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ariana, Tiffany, Vivian, Sam, for joining our conversation. I mean, stick around because the audience does have questions, of course, but I do want to, before we go into those, I want to thank you for joining us and sharing your perspectives and bringing the voices of the communities that you are working in and the organizations that you are part of. That's, this is what our community looks like and the work that we're doing. So we truly appreciate that. I want to go to our first question from Ben de Guzman. Ben is the director of the Mayor's Office on Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs for Mayor Bowser in Washington, D.C. Ben is also NQAPIA alumni. He is a former director of NQAPIA. So this is a really great NQAPIA night as well in terms of our history. So I'll read Ben's question for our panelists. Have folks done a deeper dive into data regarding hate incidents from Stop AAPI Hate, the website and the movement, of course? Are there trends that affect our constituencies? NAPAF notes that the incidents are disproportionately women. 2/3 of the incidents have been reported by women. But are there other trends that we're seeing? Queer incidents at the workplaces? What are we seeing in the data if you have been doing a deep dive into this?
So I personally haven't done a deep dive into the data, but I know that people who work with NAPAF have been doing so. And on our NAPAF social media, you can find major data points, but I was able to pull some up of the most common instances of self-reported anti-Asian racism. And about 28% are include being called a racial slur. About 26% include feeling unsafe walking around outside. About 18% are experiencing discrimination or harassment at work. About 13% sexual harassment, 11% race and gender-based violence, and about 5% are denied housing. So those are the stats that I have. But I know that NAPAF has been sharing more statistics and doing deeper dives into that as well.
And I do want to mention that from the data, in addition that 2/3 of the victims have been women, the place where it's happened has been disproportionately Asian-owned small businesses. So they have been deeply impacted structurally by the pandemic, by closures, lockdowns, the lack of assistance due to cultural and language barriers from various levels of government. And now there's also, well, not now, but throughout the pandemic, there's been a threat, and we know this 15 months ago with the targeting in Chinatowns. We saw this coming way before there was even a national emergency. So I think it's important to be highlighted places of business, which are also community spaces and anchors, have been targets of this violence. So please do put your questions in the chat. Also, I have a question about, for Sam actually. In 2022, we are seeing elections at all levels across the country. We've seen this burst of API civic engagement on the voter side. We are seeing folks like you who are being elected to office, who are LGBTQ and API across the country in Hawaii, California, Georgia. Where I am in New York City, we have several folks who are running for city council. What advice would you give for folks who are interested in participating, whether it's, running or leading campaigns or motivating their community to partake in the civic engagement process?
Do it. I mean, without a doubt, I think we not only need the next generation of leaders to rise up, and it's not just about Congress either, and it's certainly not about title or position, but we need the next generation of leaders to rise up, and certainly those who come from multiple intersectionalities that can bring with them multiple communities. We need more women in positions of power. Certainly, and in Georgia, statewide, we have some great women running for statewide office. I'm gonna give a shout out to my good friend and colleague, Representative Bee Nguyen, who is the first Vietnamese ever elected. She's running for Secretary of State, and would be the first ever AAPI elected statewide. But there's so much work that has to be done, and ultimately, it's people power that we saw during the 2020 and 2021 runoffs that helped change the course of this country. And certainly given the ongoing existential challenges that we continue to face, certainly with climate change right around the corner, we have to continue to lean in. And we have to do everything we can to ensure our communities are moving in the right direction. And the last thing I'll say is we need to do everything we can to hold our own folks accountable, and to ensure that elected officials, regardless of political party or spectrum on the political spectrum, that they are working for the people. I think it's very easy for elected officials to start thinking about their next position or begin climbing the ladder, but no. Always you have to be grounded to the people, and we have to do our part as voters and as engaged citizens to ensure that we hold their feet to the fire. Because ultimately that's what this is all about. It's about public service, and it's about we the people and protecting our democracy for the people.
Thank you. And I remember when Sam won, he flipped a district. So it's run where you run everywhere, as they say, and I think we can win everywhere. So I want to acknowledge that as well. It was not an easy race, and you did flip a district that many people didn't think you would. And I think that's something to take into 2022, that run where you want and you can win. I want to turn it over to Alex to see if you have any questions, or Tiffany for our panel.
Yeah, really quickly to write off that question, Henrik and Representative Sam's response, I want to reiterate that it is really all about representation, right? And what we're seeing here, even just with this API panel here and the accomplishments that we've seen with Representative Sam, and with the organizations, with labor, nothing is impossible, right? And so with Representative Sam flipping a district, we also, we know that Dr. Rachel Levine, who was picked as President Biden's, Secretary of Health, first openly transgender federal official to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Nothing is impossible. And as long as we work with grassroots organizations, as long as we really push for bills that we are very passionate about and that will create a better, well-being for the lives of people in our country and everywhere, we can make it happen. And so I want to end on that note before I pass it over to Alex, and before we move over to API Action Night, where we're going to be focusing on the Equality Act and how we get voters and how we get you guys engaged to reach out to your senators.
I actually don't have any questions, but I was wondering if we have such a wealth of knowledge between the panelists. Do you all have questions for each other? You got to flip the script.
And Alex, before we do that, I did miss one comment that I do want to uplift, that in our aggregation of the data in terms of anti-Asian violence, also violence against seniors, that is a important demographic and cleavage to look at as we look at the data. But yes, sorry, you were saying in terms of the panelists, do they have questions for each other?
I would love to ask, even though I'm like, I don't think we can answer this in the 5 minutes, but something that we're always thinking about is, how do we have more, right? Okay, representation, but how do we make it so that it's just not one person, having to be in the state house, or one person in you know, being a president of a union, et cetera. How do we create that space so that it's not just like, you know, I was like, I mean, I folks are like, and I'll say this from a APALA angle too, you know, we are like, oh, Sam Park, he's great, LGBTQ, API, put it all together. But how do we like, and it's really actually not on us, it's on the mainstream institutions that like leave us out, right? But how do we build up a multiplicity so that it's not just like the same folks burning out over and over again? Yeah.
My thought and a general approach is, you know, systemic change, which is necessary, requires playing the long game. And that requires breaking down institutions that we've inherited that have been created to exclude, suppress, and oppress people like us. But without a doubt in my mind, we're the future. You know, the Asian American community in particular is the fastest growing demographic in this country. And we've already seen the political clout and power, political, economic, and demographic that we have today. And that will only continue to grow in the foreseeable future. And so I think it's leaders like us who've already been engaged and who are already leaning in to bring more and help bring about that systemic change and to build out infrastructure. But that question of building out long-term sustainable infrastructure, certainly for the next generation of Asian Americans in places like Georgia where it doesn't really exist, that's one that I'm quite honestly still grappling with and working on as well. But, you know, to the best of our ability, we do our part, and I think that in and of itself will help bring about the kind of systemic change in which, you know, we're not necessarily unique, but we're just, you know, this is our country just as much as anyone else's, and that the perception of what you think of when you think of an American is you know, it's our faces rather than you know, someone else's. So I think it's on us, and I think we have the power to do it as well.
Yeah, I definitely would echo that, you know, especially with looking at the infrastructure, right? I mean, putting campaigns aside, I joined the National LGBTQ Task Force because as an organization that is all about advancing, you know, justice and equality for the LGBTQ people, I say get involved with organizations that share these same values and the same morals as you do. Support candidates that you want to see in those seats, you know, whether that's canvassing, fundraising, whatever it is, it's all about the resources that you put into it. And I want to highlight again what Sam was saying about like the intentional investment that you put in. So you look at the long game of it all. And when you invest in something, it's because it's the long game goal that you're trying to reach. And so representation is one, the infrastructure is one, getting involved with individuals, organizations that advance that same goals that you have, that will add to the long game that we have. And especially here at the API community, if you want to see folks that look like us, where Sam is, or even in organizations that we have here right in front of us, get involved, get engaged, and support.
Yeah, I would second everything that's been said about building infrastructure, and that's something that's so important, and especially here in Indiana where we're working on that right now as well. And I think that from a community organizing standpoint, it's important to recognize that anyone can get involved in organizing. Everyone has a role in this movement, and it's all about what you're comfortable with, and also how much you want to push yourself out of your comfort zone. And that's why I think that having spaces for like political education and education on history and our shared movements is so important to have alongside our community members, to show that there's a space for everyone here, and that we can all work together towards building power. No matter where we're at, how much time we all have a role in this movement.
Absolutely. I'm gonna toss it to Tiffany to transition us to our next hour as we're coming on to 8 o'clock. If you have any final words for our panel or for our audience for this first hour, for my part, I want to say thank you again for the audience for joining us, for being in community with us, the panelists for bringing your expertise and your knowledge and your passion for this work. I appreciate it, NQAPIA, all of our partners. Truly, truly blessed to be in your company. And Alex, again, thank you. Yeah, Tiffany.
Yeah, no, definitely. Everything Kenrick said. And I want to thank the panelists for being a part of just this, incredibly important event tonight. And we're going to be moving it over to AP Action Night. And if I have not talked your ear off enough, you will be all about Equality Act, Equality, Equality Act. So the National LGBTQ Task Force Action Fund, along with NEAT, will be hosting Action Night to get you all engaged, to talk to your senators about the Equality Act. And so if you guys just want to give it maybe a minute or two, we can transition over and we'll go ahead and get that started.